First of all, thank you very much, Mr. Röller, for your presentation. I think that was more than useful for us because you mentioned issues which you perceive as relevant and important. You mentioned directions. So in the meeting of our co-chairs this morning, we discussed how we could be as useful as possible. And I think that after your presentation, we feel much better informed where you are interested in, and we can bring our knowledge into this kind of agenda and see how far we can push things forward. So thank you very much that you presented the whole agenda. First I would like to present the panelists, and then we go into the discussion, because Mr. Röller said that after having presented the agenda, you would like to listen. So it's up to our panelists. No. We would like to hear to your answers also, of course. But we will first listen then to the panelists. I would like to present the panelists very briefly. And I'm starting with Mercedes Méndez Ribas from Argentina. So this is very important because Argentina, as you know, is will organize the next presidency. And Mercedes is working at the Center for Implementation of Public Policies for Equity and Growth. So inclusiveness issues and economic policies and social policies, how they are coming together. Very important issues, as we already heard. So thank you very, very much, Mercedes, that you are with us. Then I do have on my right-hand side here Rathin Roy, a colleague from India, working at the National Institute for Public Finance and Policy, the whole financial system issue and tax issues which you are working on. And thank you very much, Rathin, that you accepted to be on the panel this morning. On the right-hand side, then I see Deng Xiao Chen, our colleague from China. Most of you know him because we have been working together very closely during the Chinese presidency already. And Deng Xiao Chen is director of the Shanghai Institute for International Studies. And thank you very much for being with us today. So you see, we do have the troika here. It's Argentina, it's China and Germany. So great to have you on board again and bringing the Chinese perspectives in. And last but of course not least, Edwin Truman from the Peterson Institute for International Economics in the United States. Thank you very much, Edwin, that you made it to be with us. Fantastic, because as you see, the global economy agenda, the financial system agenda is on board, and we need to listen to your voices. Oh, this is our panel, and I would like to start with the first round of comments from your perspective. Don't be longer than 3 minutes, because we would like to come into a discussion, of course. No? And maybe a starting point from my side, and then I would like to begin with Rathin, and we move through the agenda, and Dennis, you pick it up afterwards. No? I mean, what I found very important is that we had a discussion in our institute several months ago about analyzing the Australian presidency of the G20, no? And they had a very clear perspective on focusing on the economic dimensions. No? And now we see the German presidency here, which is much more comprehensive. No? I must say I like it, because we need to see, as Dennis said at the beginning, all these interdependencies. But of course, it's not easy to manage such a comprehensive agenda. No? So this is one comment. And the question is then how to combine incremental progresses, where we obviously as T20 also can contribute, with most important things and contributions when it comes to the crossroads of global economic and social development. But we might come to this point later on. Rathin, I would like to ask you to start. 3 minutes or so, your impression, your immediate reaction.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Rowling, for having, in such a detailed and I think very helpful way, explicated the aspirations of the German presidency this morning. The G20 has a conundrum which I think the T20 is best able to resolve. It is ultimately a collection of nation states, and it is ultimately driven on a day-to-day basis by bureaucracies, not necessarily by leaders. Leaders come in, but they come in a limited way. The nuts and bolts are essentially, it's a bureaucratic initiative 80% of the time, apart from the Sherpa and the leaders. For which reason, the positions that countries take tend to be repeated in the G20, and that's not helpful unless either there is push from a particular leader in a particular area, or there is a complete collapse, and that like happened in 2008, and that allows the bureaucratic clutter to be removed. We are not fully in a position where I think there is a complete collapse happening in a variety of areas that you mentioned, but we're very aware that the consequences of not doing something in a concerted way may lead us to that collapse, and the whole purpose of the G20 was to avert it. So this is, I think, where the T20 comes in. The presumption behind the T20 is that intellectuals working across national boundaries while recognizing national interests can actually transcend these narrow bureaucratic boundaries to move forward and make progress. I think that's the fundamental ambition of the T20, which would mean that while it is important to address plumbing issues. So if the leaders, the ministers want intellectual or analytical plumbing, the T20 could provide it. But in practice, what is happening is that 90% of that plumbing is already provided, I don't like this at all, by the OECD, the World Bank, and the IMF. And I don't like it because these are not organizations in which developing or emerging economies have anywhere remotely close to a significant stake in governance, not even China. But that is how it is. So what the T20 can do, I think, is offer fresh, interesting, cross-country perspectives on problems in which typically countries may actually be in dissent. I'll give you 3 examples and close. On the issue of tax governance, there are stated positions that countries have. I'm very ambitiously hoping that the tax task force will be able to transcend these differences and come up with governance solutions that would take us beyond the fiasco that happened at Addis Ababa. In the area of climate, there is the whole question of old King coal. And I think working across stated national boundaries and trying to understand the energy imperatives, and therefore I'm very glad that you're bringing those together, that developing countries have, will enable us to make some progress and get that into the leaders' mind. And finally, I think the 2030 agenda and bringing that in actually affords a huge opportunity for us to do what we couldn't do in the UN. And we are actually preparing a country review. I'm doing it. I can see we're not able to do it even at the country level, which is say something concrete about cross-country collaboration. And the G20 can do at least things like this, and the T20 can assist doing this by increasing the mind space that the bureaucrats normally do not let the G20 populate. Then I think we would have been of some use. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rathin. Mercedes.
Thank you very much for inviting us here. It's a pleasure. Thank you. My reflection would be that the role for think tanks for the T20 during the German presidency would be to act as a bridge, as catalyst between the G20 agenda, the T20 agenda, and national and regional level agendas, with 5 points. One would be analysis of the agenda, policy recommendations, research. It would be capacity development. It would be innovation, which can come across all the 5 points. It would be communicating the agenda, again, nationally and regionally, and it would be partnerships. What I would say that we might have to find, and the kickoff conference is a very good opportunity to find ways of making policy recommendations, as you said in your opening remarks, in concrete ways, so that they are useful and they are not just statements, to address challenges at regional levels and get this agenda to the G20 representatives. We can set up policy environments to get this agenda into national levels, interact with the private sector, with civic society, ways in which the think tanks know how to interact. We can make the private sector alignment and understand what the agenda would be, and not least, monitoring and evaluation. I think the kickoff conference is a good timing to monitor what the G20 agenda is, what the 2030 agenda is, set up monitoring levels, and evaluate at the end of the process whether this has been achieved. And continuity, I think, is a key issue. For only 1 year, each country being presidents, I think we need to make some continuity and evaluation at the end of this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. Dong Chiao.
Thank you. First of all, I would, on behalf of my colleagues and our Chinese colleagues as well, congratulate this kickoff meeting of T20, as well as the congratulations to the presidency of Germany to resume, to take the baton of the presidency. And I think that based upon what we have already achieved in the Hangzhou Summit the last September, which has been labeled one of the most successful, most ambitious summit meetings. Now for the next 27 summit in Hamburg, I think that we should, instead of make out a broader or ambitious program, we should focus more on the implementation as well as the continuation of some of the pillars of the Hangzhou Summit. And don't forget that in the Hangzhou Summit we have already accomplished more than 20, almost 29 important results. And to what extent that those 29 results has been a kind of a consensus signed by all the leaders of the G20. So I think that we should focus on the implementation of all those lists of the results. And I have two very serious concerns nowadays. Number one is that there's a loss of sense of urgency of implementing a lot of the agendas coming out of the G20 Hangzhou Summit, for the obvious reasons which have already outlined by our keynote speaker. And the second one, I think is also related to this loss of sense of urgency, is the deficit of the leadership. Because of the obvious reasons, and because of those political transition in many important key economies around the world, I think that on one side, we have seen the shrinking interest, lack of the political will on some of the key economies. United States, for instance, I'm not quite sure, a lot of unpredictability. On the other side, some of the other European countries which are also in the political transition this next year. So we will see that this lack of the leadership will overshadow a lot of the implementing capability in the next year. And at the same time, of course, the good news is that there's a rising enthusiasm or rising recognized awareness among those emerging economy which believe that those participation into those global economic governance are important for their domestic reform, for their domestic governance. At the same time, there's also a growing social awareness, understanding the importance of the SDGs, for instance. So I think that we have seen both the rising pressure or rising awareness of those importance of global economic governance, but also on the other side, the lack of interest or political will on the other side. So I think that this year, for the next years, we should focus on the implementation of those key results which we have already reached.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Edwin, would you like to pick up?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I was here in Berlin in 1999 for the first finance minister meeting, and had a little bit to do with the London summit. Obviously, as was just referred to directly, the U.S. Official positions is somewhat in state of flux or ignorance, if you want to put it at that time. That means that often when I speak, I try to find out where the United States government is, and then at least know when I'm going to contradict them. In this case, I don't know where the U.S. government is, so it's obviously only a personal set of comments. I think that the major issue, and this was pointed out at our introductory remarks, what I'm going to phrase slightly differently, is the one of I prefer to think about it worrying about those who are left behind, which is more than just worrying about civil society and inclusiveness, because in some sense, the organizations of civil society are actually organizations, right? And those who are left behind do not belong to those organizations. So that is, I think, the real challenge at all levels of government around the world, or at least in the advanced world. So, you know, everybody here, as referred to earlier, is part of the elites or part of the cloistered group, right? And it is very hard to figure out what one does about those who are left behind. I think there is actually more link between that theme and the migration theme. I'm going to sort of twist this. So there is a plus and a minus to migration. I think here in Germany actually, their attitude towards immigrants has been very, was on the plus side, even though it carries some minuses. But one big question, and it relates to those left behind, is why there is not more internal migration. I refer the audience to the group to an interesting book called The Hillbilly Elegy, and it basically describes a culture in the United States, Appalachia, where people have stayed for generations because they don't desire, for some reason, to get out and go to seek their fortunes, if you want to put it that way. And a lot of those people are the ones who voted, if I may put it that way, for change in the America today. So I think there is this internal migration question. And I also would urge you, when you're thinking about, and you Europeans, if I may put it that way, who are thinking about migration, realize that this is a phenomenon and a problem that every G20 country, I would say without exception, I'm not a big expert on this, has its own immigration problem. And thinking about it more in a global context might actually help to some degree. Now, a little bit on, just one point on economics and growth. So you have some degree of stagnation in the advanced economies. I'm not a big fan of secular stagnation, notwithstanding Larry Summers being once my boss, because if you think about other parts of the world, it may be an issue here for advanced economies, but it certainly is not an issue for most economies in the world. But in order to make it the emerging market and developing economies the engine of global growth, right? You have to actually change the model so that, in some sense, there's more private investment going into, external private investment going into the emerging market developing countries. And that leads to issues of the investment climate, which I would urge people to think about, and including the issue of laws and justice systems. I'm not sure this has been a G20 issue, but it is a big deal. I'm going to give a stretch and make an example. Actually, a European example. So within Europe, right, you have a bunch of European Union as a statistical agency, right, which monitors the statistical possibilities of performance of the EU countries. In one of the European countries, that is a big political issue. And indeed, the person, Andreas Georgiou, who was in charge of cleaning up the, if I may put it that way, Greek statistics, is now being prosecuted under the judicial system of Greece, right, for keeping good statistics. So all of us who are basically researchers in many respects, who rely on statistics, this is a big issue, right? And it seems to me it interchanges with the whole question of the judicial system and investment climate and restarting growth in the global economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edwin. So I would like to give Mr. Reller the word, and then Dennis, you pick up the next round of things. It's working.
Yeah. So thanks very much. I agree with a lot of these comments. I think a colleague from China I think what would be useful also in terms of moving the process forward is that you in your own countries use your influence, which I'm sure you're doing. I want to tell you what you should do, but I think it would help us very much if, in terms of the bureaucracy and what you said, that's a hard word, but I think these are all hard-working people in the ministry, so trying their best. But okay, they're bureaucracies, you're right. But in terms of moving them, including in your own country and certainly also in my country, that would help. So I think if I agree with your analysis and I ask for your help on that one. I think the bridge idea is a very good one, and I think doing good research, going back to the word there, I think is important. And you're right that we're working a lot, I think you said that, with the international organizations. But that doesn't mean that we should not be listening to, and me coming out of the university system myself for 20 years, it's important to have good research. The other question, of course, is in your country. I have no idea how in your country, you don't just, German presidency is not the one who decides everything. We depend on all the other countries. So to what extent the good research in your country, including Troika countries, of course, China also, Argentina, is then, recognized and actually taken seriously. This is a debate we're also having in Germany. I mean, Dennis being the president of a major economic research institute, Mr. Messner, to what extent the good work they do, I know that a little better than your organization, the Kiel Institute, is actually then propagated into actual policy making is an issue which goes beyond G20 actually. And I find that very important, being a former academic myself, that good research, which is peer reviewed in whatever system you do, actually is taken more seriously by policymakers. It's a difficult issue, so I think that point is good. I think also the communication idea is so important. If you could communicate into, if I understood this correctly, more into the local markets, that would then propagate up into the bureaucracies and would certainly also help, for years to come, actually, in the G20. I think the continuity is important. We've been discussing it to the extent, and I had a long discussion with Dennis and Mr. Messner on that, is to the extent that you can provide continuity in terms of accountability, monitoring from the outside and say, look, here's where you haven't lived up to snuff. I think that's important, and I certainly encourage you to do that. That all helps, I think, in the end also into the process. So I think your suggestions, Mercedes, are excellent. I think the Chinese point on implementation is understandable. Whenever you're done with the presidency, you call for implementation, and then the next presidency comes in. So we are a little bit in that problem that the new presidency comes in. So I'm giving you some room here, but I'll come back to go the other way. But there's right that whenever a new presidency comes in, of course, they have a tendency to announce what new things they will do, and not enough care is taken finishing what has been done before. So if you like golf, which I don't, it's like we're good at swinging the club back, but the follow-through is important, otherwise you don't hit the ball. So that, I think, is true, and we will take that point back, and I think it's very important to think about the implementation, and many things actually it is just implementation. But allow us on one or two things to try to add something new. Health is one of them. We are aware of the fact that we don't want to be too broad and introduce too many new topics. That's why we want to be in each of these areas, making, if possible, a precise contribution. But I think we're getting this right. And the advantage, by the way, of a year-to-year basis is that the presidency itself takes it very, I don't want to say seriously, but puts a lot of effort into it. So the German government, foreign ministry, and others are taking that very seriously. Certainly the Chinese leadership has taken it extremely seriously. is my understanding, and that was very useful. And we got very far last year, I agree. But we need to keep going. I think that's the response to that. The US, of course, I'm listening to very carefully because trying to learn something where the new administration is going. Maybe we can have a beer afterwards or a coffee, I don't know, or a whiskey, yes. No, whiskey is not my thing, but wine actually is my thing, but okay. I think, yes.
So then let's do it, right?
Yes. We're all waiting. Yes.
Yeah. Dennis.
What I'd like to do now is simply the prosaic matter of...
Oh, and I'm sorry, and the point about private investment. Yes.
Overall, yes.
The prosaic matter of summarizing what I think this means for the T20. I think we could not have had a better idea of the degree to which the government wants to engage with us than the talk we've just heard from Hendrik. And now we face an important responsibility. We need to provide concrete ideas and provide them early. There is a narrow window of opportunity. We know that the summit is on 7th and 8th of July. In practice, anything that doesn't come in between January and April is not really relevant as input into this process. And the earlier it comes in, the more opportunities for interaction. This much is obvious, but since we've organized the T20 and task forces that produce policy briefs, and that is something concrete, the briefs need to be implementable, practical ideas, and they can then be submitted to the relevant policymakers in order for a dialogue to take place. That is what the T20 ought to be all about. So for you to take home this idea that we better get our act together and produce our policy briefs, that's really important. Then in addition, we will be producing an insight platform which will enable these recommendations to be embedded within a broader policy context of commitments, agreements, things that already exist, so as to bring it closer to reality and help policymakers find their way between the relation between our ideas and what is already there. Now, that is the groundwork for the basic ideas which you have stressed, which is we are an engagement group that is not an interest group. So that gives us a special domain within which to act. And linking think tanks while using our influence in our own countries, as you have said, is a particular strength that we have. So for us to be talking to one another while each of our groups is creating its policy briefs will be important. For us to use our influence in our own countries to bring this broad perspective will be important. So this idea of linking think tanks is sort of one important idea that has come out of here. The second, I'm just repeating but summarizing, is the bridge idea, which is that we are potentially able to be a bridge between research and government and business and civil society. And so we should not believe that our ideas alone are the ones that are the only ones to be discussed, but there are important, valuable ideas coming from business, labor, other civil society institutions that we should also engage with in our capacity as think tanks, and thereby provide a bridge between us and other aspects of government and society. And the third idea is this idea of monitoring and evaluation. We need to carry on the idea of continuity that you have, means that ideas that have been brought in the past, and they've been very important ideas, need to be evaluated and monitored. And this too is something that we can do. So that's the third idea. So the linking think tanks, the bridge idea, monitoring and evaluation. And then the idea of the degree to which we get involved in understanding where the implementation lies. We are not the implementers themselves, but we can link ideas to implementers. And that too requires some continuity from one G20 process to another. And so therefore, in terms of continuity, you emphasize that within the G20, the continuity is there. Where the continuity was not there was within the T20 process, perhaps. And to provide more continuity within the T20 process would be a challenge that we should rise to in this year. And that, I think, are concrete to-dos for us. The most important are go off and write your policy briefs early. Have the think tanks use their influence and link them up, provide a bridge to the rest of society, think carefully about monitoring and evaluation, and think about implementation. So that is, and I guess it would be useful to bring the collective wisdom here to bear on this panel as well, but I'll hand over to you for...
Yeah, thank you very much, Dennis, for developing the agenda which is in front of us. I think this is very important because we need to get started working now. But I wanted to use the last minutes with Mr. Röller looking towards the auditorium because I saw some hands which raised up and I think we should listen to those. And then, Mr. Röller, you could bring these questions and comments together and listen and answer. So I saw you first, and then you, and Mr. von Braun. Okay, good. Yeah, 4 and 5. Good.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Mr. Röller. So you mentioned the subsidiarity problem when you foresee the future principle of governance within EU after Brexit. My question is venue, where subsidiarity problem will be discussed. Is it suitable among leaders like Bundeskanzler, or is it suitable among think tanks?
Okay, thank you very much. We are gathering questions. No, I saw you. And please, you need a microphone. Where are the microphones? Yeah, it's coming. Very good, thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned the importance of institutions, and particularly in the global governance sphere. So even though it's like a cross-cutting element, I think it's extremely important at this juncture to emphasize the continued faith and revival of the institutions. And I think there are 3 areas that are particularly important: trade, the role of the IMF, and the role of the multilateral development finance system, because these are the institutions in the cross-cutting areas that will play a critical role. So I know that the ministers of finance are planning some discussion on this, but in a broader level, what are your plans in this area?
Thank you very much. Joachim von Braun.
Also a question to Mr. Röller. You asked the big question, do we have the right institution, a set of institutions? And related to the key topics which you brought up, digitalization, health, agriculture, the answer is obviously no. We don't have the right institutions, they have deficiencies. So how can this group help the G20 process to come up with institutional and organizational redesigns? Can you give us a sense of realism there? Because the existing ones, the existing organizations and the institutional arrangements lack, for obvious reasons, the capacity to self-reform.
Thank you very much. I saw then two hands on the right-hand side here. Yes, the colleague in the third row first. Yep.
Yeah, hi. This is for Mr. Roller. What you said about health was music to my ears because I lead the health policy initiative at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, and I was doing some level of advocacy internally, in the discussions. But I think we should also look at chronic diseases because your focus has been on pandemics, because people are living longer and they are spending quite a bit of years with chronic diseases, and that is what really matters for people. So pandemics occur once in a while, but then chronic diseases have emerged as the leading cause of death and disability in the world, even in developing countries.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last comment or question from the lady in the fifth row. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Marianne Janssen. I work for the International Trade Center in Geneva. I have two questions related to research flowing into communication, and I'll have a trade focus for this. On communication, we are struggling in Geneva with what research to communicate on, notably related to the fact that we have been relying quite a bit on simulation outputs to refer to the gains from trade. And we have recently been seeing these findings dismissed in public debates, notably around the Brexit. So what is our next step? We have been using research findings, but it's not being accepted in the public discussion. The second question is on the inputs into this research. There's a concern about this trade collapse we are seeing, or the trade changes in trade flows we are seeing in the data. But there are also, maybe because there's a Swiss specificity there, questions about to which extent taxation, transfer pricing has been an important driver of where trade is actually registered, and whether that has been driving the trade statistics we are seeing. That's something I think could be a T20 question. What are the statistics we are using as inputs actually reflecting?
Okay, thank you very much. There was a very last question here in the first row, and then we play it back to you, Mr. Röller. Yeah, in front. Very good.
IRIA, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. My question is very simple, and the G20 actually it was evolved as a spontaneous response for the 2008 financial crisis. It is basically at Assembly of Economic Ministers and the summit leaders, and how relevant it is nowadays, and what are the issues, whether T20 can propose some more visionary and the action plan for the G20 that can be pursued.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
I'll try to be brief and direct, and I hope I understood all the questions. So thank you very much. Those are all important issues. I think the first one, going from on the subsidiarity, indeed, there is, if I understood this correctly, this is indeed a big question right now in the European Union. We're working, waiting for the British to submit Article 50. Then we're ready to negotiate, not before. That's one thing. And I think some of the trade issues are also Brexit. I think an equally, if not more important question besides Brexit, which seems to be very much in the forefront on the international interest, actually what I find more important personally is the EU 27 discussion. I think for the wealth and livelihood of our people, of course we'll have to work out a good situation with the Brexit, but the real long-term issue is really what is Europe 27 going to do. We have important elections coming up, we're having reforms in certain countries, and the question is really sort of what is the value proposition to our citizens in Europe. There are, right-wing movements in Europe to move forward, and I think that will determine really where Europe will stand in the world. And there, what we're doing is, and there are lots of think tanks working on this, and there's a heavy debate, and that's all good. In terms of the actual decision, the EU leaders have met on this right after Brexit in Bratislava, because Slovakia has the EU presidency, and it's called Bratislava Process. And one short-run goal is by March of 2017 in Rome, we're going to celebrate 60 years of the Treaty of Rome. So this is the Constitution of Europe, if you want. And by that time, leaders want to have some view on where Europe is going to go. Germany's position is very clear. The challenge is not going to be, let me be very blunt, the challenge is not going to be, I don't want to say this too negatively, on having enough ideas and new ideas and great ideas. I think that's important, or think tanks. It's important, but the challenge is actually getting a united position, which everybody will agree. Again, European Council, there's the Commission, there's the Council, there's Parliament. It's a unanimous decision. So every country in Europe is going to have to say, including, I think, the smallest one, Malta, who was just visiting. Malta is actually going to be in the EU presidency the second half of next year. They're all going to have to say, yes, that's the way we're going to go in Europe. Germany is the largest economy. The Chancellor is, I think, by now the most senior leader in Europe. And so we play a role, but we're not going to determine alone by what happens to Europe. But I think that discussion is very important. And last sentence, in that context of what is a European future and what is national, the subsidiarity, trade is a huge area in this, by the way. If you look at what happened to the CETA, which was the EU-Canada free trade agreement, how difficult it was. It's still not ratified. It goes through European Parliament, and then it will be ratified by all national parliaments. In Belgium, I think 5 or 6 of them are going to have to agree to it. So to what extent an EU, which is the largest economic entity, I'm pretty sure even without the UK, but the UK is still part of it, is actually capable of doing these deals in the future, which includes not only tariffs, but very difficult standard issues. The complaint on trade was always in Europe that we are not going to include standards and social standards in trade. Trade is a pure economic thing, and they forget all about the social parts. Now, including them has shown it becomes much more difficult, even concluding one. So then there are 2 options there. Either we don't do any more trade deals in Europe like CETA, or we fall back on the old trade tariff deals, which is precisely what all of us didn't want. So these are questions, and of course, one solution in Europe on trade would be to give more power to Brussels and let them negotiate so you don't have to ask all national parliaments, which is not the current model. And that's a subsidiarity question. So these are difficult questions which I think Europe has to take. It's a very important question. It's not going to be a G20. I mean, we're not doing Europe, we're doing G20, we're doing world. But these are important European discussions we're having. I think I agree with all of the points, very important on the institutions. You know how difficult it is to reform institutions. I think your point is more we need fundamental change in certain institutions. In health, there's the World Health Organization. I know there's a debate amongst scholars whether it's a reform or whether it's much more than just a reform. We'll see what the discussion goes, but you know the predictable thing would be that we are more looking at what are some of the additional steps we can do to strengthen institutions in the right direction. Not going to make you happy, but you know you keep making these other points, and but that's an issue, and I think this whole issue, I think about trust of global institutions is huge. World Bank, IMF, that I think relates to the discussion on what can we do to actually take our people more on board, trust in global institutions. That's not going to be solved by the German G20 presidency. Maybe we can move step in the right direction here, if at all, because we don't really know what the views of, we have India, we have China, we have the US, these are giants, and Germany is a small country compared to those three. We are very small. We are actually much bigger if we're in Europe, if we are united in Europe, but those are important players in the G20, even if we are in the presidency. Yes is the answer. I think on Brexit and on trade and trade flows and models, I think it's good work which is done. I think leaders are not going to concern themselves so much with the trade models, but I think some of the issues there are important. I know there's a trade and investment working group. Where's the lady who was asking that question?
Right inside here.
Oh, yeah. Trade and I think in that one, these things should be discussed, and I can certainly facilitate that if she sends me an email and explains that a little bit more, I'd be happy to look at that. I can't read my own writing now. The diseases, yes, thank you. Chronic diseases. Chronic diseases, huge issue, but our approach is let's chop away at the health agenda. We can't do everything at once, and in the spirit of having a bit of focus, not a bit, having significant focus on a rather broad agenda, we decided on those two topics which I mentioned. Huge issue. Maybe Argentina will do that next year, and we'll stick to our knitting right now. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Röller, for your time. Thank you very much for your keynote and for your answers and suggestions. Yeah, okay.
I apologize.
Yeah.
In terms of the way forward, again, thank you for all your work on the, I don't know if I should say this, on the 12th and 13th
we
of
already
December.
communicated this to the co-chairs of our task forces.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have our first Sherpa meeting. These two gentlemen, I think, are going to be there. The next Sherpa meeting is in March, which hopefully will be including everybody there then. Yes. And so it is actually very ideal for the two gentlemen to come in on the 12th and 13th and have an impact on the Sherpa process. So to the extent that you want to place messages into the Sherpa process, this is our deal, our understanding sounds better, that's the moment, one of the moments which is key in terms of working together.
Okay. No, we thank you very much for this opportunity, of course. I think it's a huge challenge and chance for the T20 network, and thank you very much for that. This shows that you are really interested and keen to work closely together with us. And I only wanted to end and to close our first deliberation here in saying that I think that beyond the idea of the T20 that we can produce better solutions based on pooling our knowledge and bringing it together, my understanding of the very heart of the T20 is that the collective creation of knowledge is creating legitimacy for collective action and global policies. And this has to do, Mr. Röller, with what you said about identity issues and identity challenges. And what is urgently needed is transnational identities, global perspectives, and therefore it's not only a technical process in terms of producing good technical solutions for all the many issues you mentioned, but I think that the T20 network can really produce an additional value added in this sense, creating transnational and global perspectives, and therefore creating the basics and fundamentals of collective action. So, Mr. Röller, thank you very much. It's not the last time that we are going to discuss with you. next week. Yeah, okay, we will follow up next week already. Dennis summarized the agenda of work which we are going to have to deliver on. So I think we had a very, very good start, and we move into the coffee break now for 15 minutes, moving then into the issue of societal cohesion and globalization. And please be back at 11:15. Thank you very much, Mr. Röller, again.